box.
My lords, what a pleasure to follow the noble Lady Baroness Jones of Milscombe. Lady Jones and I met somewhat implausibly on the slopes of Mount Sinai some 30 years ago. She was then in a previous incarnation as an archaeologist, and I like to think that we've been friends ever since. And when I say friends, I don't mean that we're on nodding terms when we pass in the corridor. I mean, we're actual friends. We like each other, and I don't think I've ever felt the need to preface my remarks by saying, although we rarely agree, or although we have very different views. It's odd that so many people feel the need to handle opponents with tongs in that way. It strikes me as a both belittling and self-absorbed way of putting distance between. Why on earth should we be expected to agree with our friends? Wouldn't it have gone without saying for most of our recent history that you could have friends across the divide? No one would have thought it remarkable. My lords, give me liberty to know, to utter, and to argue freely according to conscience above all other liberties. So wrote John Milton in 1644. I cite the blind sage for two reasons. First of all, there's a certain karma in quoting him here. John Milton was no fan of the House of Lords, and he was particularly no fan of the episcopacy. Indeed, the man that Dr. Johnson referred to as an acrimonious and surly Republican was so against all kinds of authority that his libertarian principles spilled over even into his magnum opus, Paradise Lost. It's notable that the Almighty himself gets some rather bad lines. It's as though Milton's dislike of prelates and princes spilled over into a certain disdain even towards his creator. But I cite him also for another reason, which is just to ask your lordships to dwell on the extraordinary fact that those words could have been uttered in 1644. How radical, how revolutionary, how earth-changing they must have seemed. Up until then, every civilization had assumed that there was a supreme truth and that it was interpreted by some aristocratic or sacerdotal class. The idea that you could reach the truth by experimentation, by argument, by trial, by testing ideas, was an extraordinary one. And it was an idea largely developed in the language in which you're now listening to these words. The phrase civil liberty dates from 1644. It was a long time before any other tongue came up with an equivalent. The phrase liberty of conscience dates in English from 1580. And I want to dwell on just how extraordinary it is that we moved away from this tribal ethic that had defined our entire existence as a species until then, this fundamental ethic, my tribe good, your tribe bad, into this idea that you could have a constant test and that you would get to the truth through a cacophony of different ideas. I think Milton would have shared the Most Reverend Primate's definition of whether it's fitting as well as frank. He made a great deal of the distinction between liberty and license. License for him was giving into your animal appetites. Liberty was a virtuous application of reason, a kind of informed consent. When you'd read up about the subject, you could make a free choice in a more intelligent way. Knowledge, he once wrote, is but opinion in good men. In other words, what people begin putting forward as a radical idea becomes the accepted consensus if it turns out to be true. The good ideas drive out the false ones over time. Now, this may sound terribly basic when I say it now, but I don't think it is. I think we've lived through this little bubble where we've taken those ideas for granted. A lot of societies never got there. We didn't have it until fairly recently, and I wonder whether we might come to look back on recent years, the last 2 or 3 centuries, as a kind of brief interglacial, with long stretches of cold before and in front, when people went with certainty and with tribal identification, rather than with the idea of piloting or trialing ideas or letting others argue against them. And the primary duty of inculcating this rather difficult idea, of teaching people this counterintuitive thought that someone you don't like might still have something to tell you, that you don't know everything, that we all start from ignorance and that we can constantly refine our understanding, that fell mainly on our educators. We needed constantly to habituate people to this way of thinking. The great philosopher Hannah Arendt, the chronicler of the Eichmann trial, once wrote, "Every generation, Western civilization is invaded by barbarians. We call them children." And of course, what she meant by that is you and I came into the world with pretty much the same mental and emotional apparatus that we would have done 5,000 years ago. The reason we don't live in the way that our ancestors lived 5,000 years ago is because we're able to build culture, civilization on accumulated knowledge, and we're able to do that because we accept empiricism, reason, the scientific method, the ability to test ideas and refine and improve them over time. And what worries me is that we are ceasing to do that. Not only our universities, but even our secondary schools are reverting to a much older heuristic of holding up identity and accident of birth and physiognomy rather than reason. I participated teaching in a summer school over the summer just gone, appropriately called the John Locke Institute, which tries, rather like what the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Birmingham, was describing from his home city, tries to teach young people the idea of what the administrators of that course called generous listening. It's a lovely phrase, generous listening. Generous listening meant not waiting patiently or impatiently for the other person to stop speaking so that you can jump in. It meant properly trying to engage with where they were coming from. And if they use a loose word, don't pounce on that word. Don't engage with their weakest argument. Engage with their best argument. They organised at the Oxford Union something that they called the ideological Turing test debates, where the young people would be given a topical debate: should statues come down, should private schools be abolished? And you had to guess whether they really meant it. They had to, in other words, to master the other point of view well enough that they would have passed the Turing test and people wouldn't have been able to tell whether they believed what they were saying. Now, my lords, isn't that the sort of thing that all our schools should be doing? Isn't that the sort of thing that all our universities should be doing in order to equip people to function in modern society? And I fear that when they do the opposite, when they say the most important thing about you is that you're female or white or whatever it is, then instead of teaching those counter-cyclical truths, they are teaching pro-cyclical tribalism. Let me close by, maybe at some risk if she watches me, by citing my elder daughter, of whom I'm very proud. She's reading French and linguistics, and as a condition of being where she is at university, she was told she needed to do an unconscious bias test. What's that got to do with French? Well, 200 years ago, had she not been female, had she been at the same university, as a condition of matriculating, she'd have been subject to the Test Act. She would have had to abjure the doctrine of transubstantiation. She would have literally had to have sworn an oath saying that she didn't believe that the bread and wine in the Eucharist were the literal body and blood of our Lord. What's that got to do with French? As much or as little as the unconscious bias test. And if you can't see that, you're in the matrix. In the 200 years between those two test acts, flourished a free civilization. By heaven, we'll miss it when it's gone.